so glad to have you on the program today. If you could just quickly start off by giving an introduction and background to yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. My name is Tamar, and I lead product accessibility inclusion at Verily. Who is Verily? It's often a little bit of a question mark for folks. So we're just really quickly, Verily Life Science has three main pillars: supporting research, driving direct care, mostly in population health management, and then financing some of that work. Where do we come from? So we were a spinoff of Google. In 2016, Google became an alphabet, and many bets were made across the different industries, and care was one of them. So Verily was born out of that structure, and it's really the idea of putting together clinical expertise, technical expertise, data science, AI, and machine learning to drive solutions for some of the more complex problems that exist in the world which we live in today. So we're particularly interested in the bridging the gap between research and care.
And on that topic of bridging the gap, I was going to ask you, how does Verily try to help close that health equity gap?
Yeah, so good question. So healthcare across the United States, we know, and I've heard some of the conversation earlier, it's not equal, right? We know that. So in research, there's an absence of diverse representation in the population in clinical trials. So we're not getting the true representative data of population, and that limits our ability to improve care for everyone. And on the care side, talking about, let's give an example, the chronic care disease and heart disease is an example. These are the number one killer of individual in this country, even during high of COVID. So it's still the chronic diseases that is driving the most mortality across the country. But if you think about from like a health equity standpoint, if you're a part of the marginalized community, so if you're in America and you're African American, you're 1.5 to 2 times more likely to have chronic disease, and you might be twice as likely to die from diabetes, for example, complication, than others in society. So it's really hard to think about improving health if you're not thinking about that broader approach. We cannot leave folks behind. So I don't think that one company can solve this, right? Like obviously there has to be different influences that happen across different circles to close the gap on health inequality. But technology companies such as Verily can do their job to remove barriers to increase access for people from marginalized communities.
And speaking on technology, how does Verily use technology to enable better health outcomes?
So I can give a few examples what we think is a reasonable approach for companies across the country to take. And I'm going to give what we do as an example. I know that there are a lot of other great companies that are thinking about this deeply. I think that the first thing is the idea of it requires a cultural change within the organization. And so Verily, what we did is that we started a health equity center of excellence that brings together representatives from across the organization to really tackle this holistic approach to equity, because we all have a role to play. So this is one. The second thing, and this is more the product inclusivity approach, thinking about it, most companies, right? They design, they build, they sell, and market for the average user. So if you think about this like bell curve, and then in the middle of the bell curve, there's like this average users that have like average vision, hearing, mobility, cognition, kind of like middle class. This is where most companies kind of like create products for. In healthcare, this curve is actually reversed. So in healthcare, people who are eligible to participate in clinical trials, people with key health conditions, are more likely to be living in the extreme of those bell curves, right? So these will be people with disabilities, the older adult communities, people of color, people that maybe English is not their first language, right? So from a product standpoint, what we need to make sure is that we design for those extreme cases so they can also interact with our products and be able to share the data, to view the data. So our approach is to design with and for those marginalized communities. And what we're saying is that if we know that if we do that, then what would happen eventually is that everyone in the middle of that bell curve or eventually would benefit, right? Because if we design this for the extreme, then everyone would benefit. And just like a quick example, we're using this conversation with like using Zoom. Zoom
Right.
have closed captioning, right? Like you and I talked about it. Closed captioning was initially created for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. But guess what? Like we can all use them, right? So if English is not my first language, if I'm in a very loud environment and I cannot hear this presentation, I can just turn it on. Or if, I have learning differences, sometimes having this extra can help. And so the idea is that, if you're designing and building things with marginalized communities in mind, then everyone can benefit. So this is the second thing. How are we doing it? We're doing with something that we call a co-design. So we don't design for marginalized communities, we design with them. So we have this thing that's called a co-design sessions, which means that over a course of the product development lifecycle, we're bringing people from diverse communities to really design with us and provide us feedback and partner with us to create this inclusive experience. The other thing that we do is we also pay attention to language. So we developed an inclusive language guide to help us mind the language that we use and boost inclusivity across our product. So for some, some of the straightforward things are we really care about the pronouns that you use in our application. We really care for how we address communities and how we put our questions in a way that we think is respectful, and we test those obviously in the market rate in the marketplace, right? And then in addition to that, and this is in collaboration with our brand and marketing team, we check that every single part of the building blocks of our brand and product, so looking into typeface, color combination, 1 in every 9 individuals colorblind. So how do you make sure that the typeface, the color combination, the components that are building our product are meeting and exceeding our accessibility and inclusive requirements? And then, so making sure that everything that we build on top of this is inclusive. And then on top of that, we're also integrating accessibility and inclusion checkpoints throughout the product development lifecycle to make sure that nothing that we create is launching without us thoroughly reviewing. I know that we're like super short in time. And so the last thing that I would also say is that, I heard that people here on the conversation are coming also from like a smaller companies, and there's a lot of startups. And I think that the message from my end will be, even if you're a small startup company and you're thinking about all these things that I like quickly rushed through in terms of co-design with others, making sure that accessibility and inclusion is part of the development process, how do you start this, right? So, and I think that the idea is that don't be afraid to start with just this one thing. Because I think that in order for us to really close the gap on health inequality, we all have a role to play. And so even if you don't have the budget even for a co-design sessions, because we pay our participants, what if you go and volunteer and just get to know the users, get to know who you're designing for? So there are other really creative ways that we can do, that we can all do, regardless of your role, regardless of the budget, or if you're in a smaller or bigger company, that can help, that can really help us drive and close the gap on health inequality.
I love that. That was so well said in such a short amount of time. So thank you so much for talking to us today and explaining Verily, and also help us understand how we can better close that gap. It's super interesting. I didn't even think about, for example, the colorblind example before. Just little things that you can think about that really overall help build trust in the community and help have collaboration and stuff. So thank you so much, Tamar, for hopping on today and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.